Facebook. This is Mark Melton, and we have Matthew Allen here. I am the deputy editor for Providence, and I'm also the host of the Foreign Policy Provcast. Matthew is one of our new interns with Providence, and yeah, what else do you want them to know about you?
So I'm the resident Brit in the office, so I've been deemed qualified to talk about the recent results and what it could mean for Brexit. I recently wrote an article that went up online on why there's an election in the first place and what potential outcomes could mean for the country. And so I'll touch briefly on that for anyone who's still curious as to why there even was an election when the previous one was in 2015, just 2 years ago. So essentially there was no need to call for an election, but Theresa May, who was the current Prime Minister, figured that it would be a way in which she could secure a more stable control of the country going into tough negotiations with the European Union, having those negotiations start in just 10 days from now, and then only having 2 years to formalize leaving agreements. She wanted to have much more backing and a much more secure control of her own party and prove that she had much more support from the country. Sadly, we can see from the results that didn't really work out for her, that the Conservatives actually lost seats in this election, and they've ended up in a weaker position than they started with. So I would argue that this was a real gamble that she played that was somewhat unnecessary. She could have continued for another 3 years as the Prime Minister before having to call another election, and this is just a risk that was unnecessary and didn't really pay off for her. But I know that Mark, you have a slightly different take on that.
Well, I think you were saying earlier that it was an unwise decision. I personally, if I was Theresa May, I think I would have called this election, because at that time, there was a chance to get a 150-seat majority, and that would have given her a lot of room where if you have backbenchers who are either wanting either the hard Brexit or the soft Brexit, which we have some articles on Providence that kind of explain those terms for people who aren't familiar. But if you have people on the back bench who could threaten her, she, with a 150-seat majority, could soften that blow a little bit. And she would also have 5 years until she has to call another election, because for those who aren't familiar with the British system, you can call an election, unlike the American system where it's kind of rigorous as far as when you have to hold the election. So she would have given herself 5 more years, a 150-seat majority, and it looked like Corbyn was going to just kind of self-destruct further. So I think it was a wise move. It was a gamble, but obviously it was poorly executed. I think some of the issues that kind of reading about the dementia tax, which the Conservatives had to change their manifesto, I think, within 4 days, which really backfired and also caused them to go from being the strong and stable party to being very wobbly. And that kind of cut the main selling point for Theresa May and the Conservatives. And of course, there's all sorts of other issues that are going on in every single election. And so yeah, that's my kind of hot take.
Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, we had Corbyn, who ran an excellent race and surprised many people, many of his own MPs, who it was quite enjoyable to watch them apologize to him publicly on TV last night for their lack of hope in his leadership. But he really turned things around. Having last year, the Labour Party had a vote of no confidence in his leadership, in which 80% of his own MPs voted against him. So for him to turn it around and have this massive gain in seats this year was a surprise for many, and just I think was partly due to blunders on the Tory side, but also just an excellently run campaign on his side. And it was interesting to see the spread of the results as well. I think in terms of there were changes across the country, different regions that had traditionally voted one way switching. Canterbury was one constituency that had voted Tory for the last 100 years and switched to Labour by quite some margin this time. And also just having a look at the map, if you take a look on any news site, like maybe the New York Times, you'll see that they cover the UK map in blue with these small dots of red, where there's such a huge rural-urban divide with the young professional or academics in the cities and densely populated areas voting 70 or 80% Labour, and then the more rural parts of the country voting Conservative very strongly. And there was some transitions in the Scottish vote as well that I know you wanted to talk about.
Oh, I spent some time in Scotland, and so I have tried to keep a tab of what's going on there a little bit. And I thought that the most interesting result out of Scotland, of course, is the collapse of the Scottish National Party, and then also the rise of the Tories, where I think they gained, was it 12 seats? Yeah, they gained 12 seats from 1, and especially after Thatcher, where the conservative Tories became very toxic, and so it'll be interesting to see going forward, does this translate not just where they can get members of parliament, but they can also get Scottish members of parliament elected, and what impact does that have on Brexit, also on Scottish independence, whether that is still on the table, and I think that question depends on what does Brexit ultimately look like, and if it's going to be a hard Brexit. A Scottish independence referendum may still be on the table. Whether or not it actually passes would be a different story, or whether or not Theresa May, if she remains Prime Minister, would allow it to happen. But those will be some interesting dynamics going forward to keep an eye on.
And one thing that's going to be interesting in seeing how what Brexit ends up looking like is the current situation we now have with the possible coalition forming between the Conservatives and the Democratic Unionist Party, which I'm sure many of you haven't heard of. It's one of the two main parties in Northern Ireland, and they got 10 seats in this election, which is enough to bring the Conservatives over that magic number of 326 seats to gain a majority between them. And they're a very conservative right-wing group, but are also they want a softer Brexit because they've said they want to keep a frictionless border with the rest of Ireland. And so while their view of Brexit and most other policies are very specific to Northern Ireland and their desire to remain united and with a shared in recognition of their shared history with the rest of Ireland, that would affect how Theresa May is able to conduct her Brexit negotiations, considering that the party that she's now partnering with want to go for a much softer version of the Brexit deal than what Theresa May had previously been going for. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out.
Especially that land border where they used to have a hard border where there's a lot of checks, and of course that with the Irish independence and everything else with that conflict there, having that frictionless border where you can move across back and forth very easily helps lessens that tension, and if that has to be reimposed, then that'll be interesting to see how British and Irish relations develop after that. So be sure to check out the website. We are going to run a couple of articles about this, and thanks for watching.